DG, over to you. I think they prefer that you come here, all the microphones are over here. After the DG has spoken, we'll have an opportunity to take your questions. See, this microphone is now back on. Over to you, DG.
Thank you, Clayson. So we've just completed the first Sherpa meeting, so it's day 2 of plenty, as we said, as we closed the meeting. It was a very successful Sherpa meeting. The discussions were robust, but very inclusive. We started off yesterday with Minister Lamola opening the Sherpa meeting, and we outlined what you and I already know, that our theme of our presidency would be solidarity, equality, and sustainability. Minister Lamola just outlined, for example, how we're going to amplify the voices of the Global South around these themes as part of our presidency. We have 15 working groups in the Sherpa track, which will essentially drive the agenda around ensuring that these themes have specific outcomes in the various working groups. Within those 15 working groups, they will also look at, for example, issues that the President has felt is very important, and that includes strengthening disaster resilience and responses, and I think this is based on the fact that climate change is with us, and that the damage arising from climate change needs a specific response. There's also going to be focused on ensuring that debt sustainability for low-income countries are addressed, and I'll talk about how that is also linked to the Cost of Capital Commission. There's been a specific priority on mobilizing finance for a just energy transition. This has just been reinforced by the Sherpas that this is a very important issue, that we must focus on this in the working groups, and that the Sherpas must also delve deeper into the issues of climate change and also financing the green transition. There was agreement that the South African priority on harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth is important, and this should also be championed through the working groups. Of course, you note that we've also lifted a few things up, and we presented this to the Sherpa track in detail. I think there was a sense that they appreciated the preparedness by South Africa on these issues. So we presented in detail our approach to inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, and reduced inequality, which will be Task Force 1. I think that this is a multidisciplinary issue, was appreciated, and robust discussions on how we can ensure that it is implemented. We also presented and discussed our task force on food security, and again, strong support for this task force by the Sherpas, with very good recommendations emerging in the last couple of hours on how we can ensure that we focus on food security at a regional and global level, and thereby complementing what Brazil has already started. So again, I think a good start there. Strong support too for the task force on artificial intelligence, data governance and innovation for sustainable development. Lots of inputs from the Sherpas on how we can ensure that artificial intelligence, data governance, and also how we ensure that we're developing countries at the sources of data, and the accumulation of data through AI processes is done by the North, is more balanced, but again, strong support for this by the Sherpa group. We had significant discussions on our proposal to do a review of the G20 at 20. Our proposal here was that we, at the end of the cycle of the first G20 set of meetings, it was started by the US and South Africa is the last. Again, support for the fact that this is timely, that we need to assess what is the purpose of the G20, what is the mandate of the G20, what are the agreements that have been made on various tracks over the last 20 years, what has been achieved, and then with an assessment what enabled that achievement. We must also look at what was not achieved and what are the disabling factors. So a methodology For that review will be developed so that we ask the right questions, get the right answers, do the proper analysis, and that by the time we get to the end of our presidency in November, we can give them clear recommendations on how to improve the G20. There's also a clear sense that this review does not formalize the G20. The G20 members seek to remain relatively informal so that levels of flexibility are maintained, but also to make sure that it doesn't seem to seek to compete with formal multilateral institutions like the UN and the AU and others, where you have secretariats. Okay, so they appreciated the fact that South Africa will also follow on from the Brazilian approach to engage with civil society and also have a G20 social summit. We've also managed to engage with the UN. You know, there will be a social summit convened by the UN next year, so there's going to be a lot of synergies on that. We had significant discussions on the cost of capital commission. Again, strong support from all quarters. You know, not just from the developing countries or the AU, strong support for this from almost, in fact, from everybody, including the developed North, with countries offering support, including ensuring that we have the right kinds of people that will ensure that there's a robust technical discussion, but then also the political work is inclusive. So I think all in all, a very successful 2 days, a successful start to our presidency from the level of the Sherpas. Tomorrow the Sherpa track has a short engagement with the finance track, a joint meeting on the finance track. We will just basically repeat some of the key issues that have emerged from the Sherpa track and then have a discussion on one of the existing task forces that deals with health financing. But again, so, you know, we feel quite confident that we've made the right start. We're very appreciative to Investec for this wonderful space, which made the work a lot easier. We're also appreciative of Discovery that also made some of their offices available for meetings that we could not hold in this forum. So the partnership with the private sector is important, and we will continue that throughout our presidency. I'm not sure if you want to say anything in addition? Okay.
All right. Be happy to take questions.
Do we stay here for the questions?
Yes, but you may have to come up here because this is where the microphones are. You know the drill, just identify yourself in the media house, then we'll get your questions. Let's start first round. You got the microphone? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. It's Kopanugumbi from Reuters. Kopanugumbi from Reuters. Yeah. 2 questions for me quickly. How high on the agenda was the Middle East conflict, so essentially Palestine and Israel, as well as the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and addressing them? We know from the previous G20 meetings that, you know, agreeing on the language around how we address those became a challenge. So I wonder if it came up now. And then secondly, were there discussions or some proposals put forward about addressing increasing levels of protectionism across the global economies? Thank you.
All right, get the next one. This side, in the middle.
Good afternoon, Nokanya Mdamba from Eyewitness News. 2 questions from me, please. The first is, considering that climate change is high on the agenda, DG, you mentioned just now, are there any real concerns among the member states about a Trump presidency possibly undermining some of the headway that you've made? And if there is any concern, is it too soon to tell how you're going to mitigate against President Trump possibly reversing some of those gains? And the second one, just a question about Nigeria possibly making a bid to join G20. I know South Africa, if I'm not mistaken, has already announced its support somewhat for Nigeria. Are there any possibilities of those talks happening now within this year? Is it too soon as well to get any sense about whether there is any possibility of Nigeria being admitted anytime soon, and what sort of bid you're making to the other member states? Thank you.
I can take 2 more. Right at the back, and then Start at the back.
Aviram Dila from ENCA. Are the global north countries warming up to the suggestions of around the financial architecture, the global financial architecture just being leveled up, the restructuring of the global financial architecture? And is anything being said about the threats from the President-elect of the US when it comes to BRICS and higher tariffs when it comes to trade?
Karen, you be the last for this round.
Thank you. Karine du Plessis from the Africa Report. I just have a question about the sponsorship. You mentioned, DG, about you thanking the private companies for coming to the table. Is there any money that you won't take? Because I see the Treasury said they won't work with McKinsey. They won't take money from McKinsey. So, so I'm just wondering, how do you vet the people that you take money from for the summit? Because, it's important.
You always have the nicest questions, Karen. DG?
So Kolisa will deal with the question on the protectionism issue because he dealt with that specifically. Okay. On the geopolitical issues, so what we outlined right from the beginning, and there was agreement to this, is that the geopolitical issues remain important, whether it's Palestine, Ukraine, increasingly we're putting on the agenda Sudan. There was in the last summit a couple of months ago, we couldn't have a proper discussion on Sudan because some delegations didn't want to broaden the geopolitical discussions. But there's a recognition that the world is going to become more complex, and we're going to have all of the conflicts discussed in more detail, even though there's a sense that this should not be done by the G20, that it should be done by the UN and the Security Council and those bodies that we can't run away from it. But what we did agree upon is we will follow the Brazilian route. The geopolitical issues will be dealt with by the Sherpa, which is ourselves, the foreign ministers, and the leaders. The Sherpa will engage in the discussions, develop the kind of approach that the foreign ministers will finesse for approval by the leaders, which is exactly what happened in Brazil, even though the discussions in the last week were still significant, the last week of the negotiations before the summit. So it's on the agenda. This particular 2 days, reference was made to all of these, but we will have a dedicated Sherpa meeting on the geopolitical issues. And Palestine will definitely be there, Ukraine, and the other conflicts that are emerging. Kolisa will deal with the issue, Kopano, on protectionism, so you'll come back on that. On the questions by a colleague from Eyewitness News on the Trump presidency, so the US was there. We had a representative from the US who was part of the Troika, and as is the norm, the Troika were always the first key speakers, so the US participated very robustly today in the discussions. There was no formal discussion in the Sherpa meeting of a particular threat coming in from an incoming Trump presidency. I think the G20 members were just focused on how do we drive the climate change agenda as the G20, are cognizant of the fact that there may be challenges emerging with a potentially emerging, but it's too soon to tell whether that will be a reality or not. We will be able to see that in the next, after January the 20th, and perhaps in the months coming after that. So, as it stands, the climate change agenda remains strong within the G20. In fact, as I just pointed out, there was a suggestion we need to delve deeper into climate change, delve deeper into the issues of financing of a just transition. So really positive outcomes from the G20, and at this stage supported strongly by the US. So if that changes, we will come back as a Sherpa group to see how we manage that. On the question of Nigeria, I think when we launched South Africa's G20 presidency in Cape Town, the president was quite clear that if the issue of Nigeria's membership of the G20 comes up, South Africa will obviously be right in front to support that. It did not come up in the last 2 days, and part of the G20 review at 20 will look at, for example, the manner in which new members are included. So that's going to be part of the review process. So that came up from the floor very specifically. I think that now that the AU is a member, many of the other regional groupings also seek membership of the G20. So there's going to be significant discussions about the criteria for membership. There is a sense that we shouldn't grow too much. And then part of the review is also going to look at how do we best use the partner, the guest countries. You know, there's permanent guest countries, and at points different presidencies invite different countries. But we're also going to be discussing how to best use the international organizations and the guest countries. So no specific issue over the last 2 days on Nigeria. We were very focused on ensuring that we focused on having a discussion on the concept notes, the issue papers on our priorities, and getting advice from our colleagues on how to improve on that, and that was the focus. On the global financial architecture, yes, I think there's, a significant commitment to ensuring this happens. The reform of the MDBs is high on the agenda of both the finance track and the Sherpa track. And there was commitment again today that this must happen. We're also looking at why is it slow in certain circumstances, and this is where the discussion of the G20 at 20 is so important. Some of the criteria issues that we're going to look at is it perhaps slow in some areas because of a lack of political will? Is it slow in some areas because we take for granted that even though we have consensus, that unstated opposition in that consensus may lead to resistance? So there's a lot of good discussions taking place there, but there's definitely commitment on that. On BRICS trade and the threat on that coming from incoming president of the US, none of that took place today. The G20 discussion today was just focused on how do we drive the agenda emanating from South Africa's presidency, how do we amplify what emerged from Indonesia, India, and Brazil, particularly on the Sustainable Development Goals and the focus on inequality and ensuring that the Global South and the needs of the Global South and the African countries are front and center. So I don't think, and I wasn't out of the room for more than 20 minutes, so at no point did this come up in any of the discussions. Karin, your last question then on sponsorships. We've got a sponsorship committee co-chaired by National Treasury and by DIRCO, and we will share whatever sentiments our co-chairs, which is the CFOs of these two entities, feel is appropriate. So if National Treasury is uncomfortable with a particular donor, we would perhaps be sharing that. But as you know, McKinsey is not sponsoring any of the government tracks. McKinsey, the challenge is the fact that they may be involved with the B20. The B20 is a civil society business grouping and not linked to government. And I think that is a question you should go be asking the chair of the B20 very specifically. Kolisa, you want to take the one on protectionism?
Good evening. On the question on protectionism, firstly, it's important to recognize that the G20 is made up of the 20 most developed economies of the world. Therefore, these countries that are of necessity supposed to be driving an agenda for open trade and free trade. So the G20 has previously made commitments for promoting open and free trade. However, in this area, we have not yet succeeded as such. You may recall that the 13th Ministerial Conference of the WTO was held in Doha, and most of us, both the developed and developing countries, left that conference with equal levels of dissatisfaction, less progress on fisheries subsidies, less progress on agricultural subsidies. Therefore, to answer your question directly, in this meeting, in the two-day meeting, there was a lot of discussion on the need for open trade, on the need for less protectionism. If you look at the priorities of South Africa, when we talk about the high-level deliverable on inclusive growth and employment and inequalities, as well as the high-level deliverable on food security, both of those require open and free trade. So in that context, there was a lot of discussion, there was a lot of recommitment by members of the G20 to do away with protectionism. But this is an ongoing work that the G20 will continue being engaged on. The next ministerial conference of the WTO MC14 will be held on the African continent in Cameroon, and that particular point was also raised in the sense that this G20, our G20 is being held on the African continent. So there's an expectation that before we go to MC14, during our presidency of the G20, we will give some impetus to open and free trade, to doing away with protectionism. But this is an important point of concern for G20 members. Thank you.
Right. Second round. Third round is not guaranteed. Let's see. Over here, microphone, please.
Thank you very much, the Telemark News Agency. Did you agree the timetable for the next meetings, Sherpa meetings, and especially the meetings of the foreign ministers? And if agreed, where it will take place and when?
Right. Checking if there are more hands. Doesn't look like. Looks like we've covered everyone. All right. That was the last question, DG. And we can conclude.
Thank you. We've got the second Sherpa sitting at the back there, so I'm wondering if she wants to take questions. No. The timetable for the next meeting was approved by our cabinet, and it was now shared with the Sherpas. So there's a detailed schedule of all the meetings that will take place. I can just share that the foreign ministers meeting will take place in February of this year in Johannesburg. That's all I can say. Next year, I keep thinking that we're already in next year. Yeah, February of 2025. That's it. So the full schedule has been circulated to all the relevant Sherpas and other stakeholders.
Thank you very much. That concludes the briefing. Thank you for coming through. It is true that the second Sherpa is sitting in the room right at the back. Her name is Advocate Nabukanya Chele. Welcome, ma'am. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen of the media. We will invite you again. Check your inboxes. Thank you very much.